Hello everyone, I'm the Dark Teller. Tonight prepare yourself for an unforgettable experience filled with spine-chilling scary stories. Each tale is designed to evoke fear and suspense, perfectly paired with the calming sound of rain to help you relax before you drift off to sleep. Share your location and the time you're watching in the comments. If these chilling stories leave you shivering, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Settle in, embrace the fright, and let the scary stories take you on a thrilling journey. My story begins about 5 years ago, in a small town tucked away in the mountains. I was fresh out of college, looking to get experience as a photographer, and I developed a fascination with abandoned places. I loved capturing the remnants of history, the quiet decay of forgotten buildings. That's how I ended up in Woodhaven, a near-deserted town about a 3-hour drive from where I lived. My friend Clara had heard rumors of an old asylum on the outskirts of Woodhaven, a sprawling, crumbling building left untouched since the 1970s. The stories surrounding it were strange. Unusual sounds at night, odd lights flickering in empty windows, shadows moving where they shouldn't. Locals said the place was haunted, but I shrugged it off. I was young and curious, drawn to the thrill of exploring somewhere untouched for decades. We left on a misty Saturday morning in October. I remember the way the fog hugged the narrow mountain roads, wrapping around the trees, making everything feel smaller and more isolated. Clara and I didn't talk much on the drive. There was an odd tension in the air, though I couldn't tell if it was the nerves or the eerie quiet that seemed to settle around us. When we arrived in Woodhaven, it felt as though we'd stepped back in time. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, and the few people we saw seemed to avoid eye contact. Clara joked about how we looked like outsiders, two city kids with cameras and backpacks, sticking out like sore thumbs. We stopped at a small diner for lunch, and when we asked the waitress for directions to the old asylum, her face turned pale. She shook her head, muttering, "Best leave that place alone, kids." She didn't say anything more, just refilled our coffee and walked off. Clara laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. It took us about 20 minutes to find the place. The asylum stood on the edge of a dense patch of forest, tall and foreboding against the sky, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and shattered windows, staring out like empty, watchful eyes. The air was thick with an odd smell, a damp, earthy scent mixed with something faintly metallic. I shivered as we approached, but shrugged it off as nerves. The front doors were chained shut, but Clara had come prepared. She slipped around to the side and found a broken window, large enough for us to squeeze through. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and decay. Our footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, amplifying the silence. I kept my camera ready, snapping shots of peeling wallpaper, rusted bed frames, and scattered remnants of the past. Old medicine bottles, yellowed papers strewn across the floor, and cracked tiles beneath our feet. As we ventured deeper, the halls grew darker, the rooms more ominous. Every so often we'd hear something, like a faint whisper or a creak in the distance. At first, we brushed it off as the building settling or whined through the cracks, but soon enough, the sounds started to feel intentional. A low, drawn-out scraping echoed from down the hall. Clara froze, looking at me with wide eyes. "You heard that too, right?" she whispered. I nodded, forcing a laugh. "Probably just the wind." But inside, I wasn't so sure. The halls seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. Twice we ended up in the same hallway, despite trying to move deeper into the building. The air grew colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We finally found what must have been the main ward, a large room with rows of rusted beds, each with restraints still attached to the sides. It was a disturbing sight, seeing those empty beds lined up, as if waiting for patients that would never come. I took a few pictures, but something about the room made me feel exposed, vulnerable. like if I turned my back, something would reach out. Then, as I was adjusting my camera, I saw Clara's face change. Her eyes went wide and her mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. She pointed behind me, her hand trembling. Did you see that?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. I turned around, heart pounding. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But I felt a chill run down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was no one there, but I'd swear on anything I could feel someone watching me. Clara insisted she'd seen something, a figure standing just behind me, staring straight at us. I tried to shake it off, reasoning that maybe the dim light and her nerves were getting to her. But as we moved to leave, I thought I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, disappearing into the hallway. I didn't mention it to Clara, not wanting to scare her further, but I felt a creeping dread settling in my chest. As we made our way back toward the exit, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew thicker, colder, and an overwhelming sense of unease wrapped around us. We took a wrong turn somewhere, ending up in a narrow corridor lined with old patient rooms. The doors hung open, the beds inside stripped bare, except for one room near the end. Its door was closed, unlike the others. Clara reached out to open it, but I stopped her, feeling an inexplicable urge to leave it alone. She looked at me puzzled, but nodded. We kept walking, though the feeling of being followed grew stronger. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw something move, like a shadow that vanished the moment I looked. We finally reached the room where we'd entered, but something was different. The light filtering through the broken windows was dimmer, and the silence felt heavier, like a presence pressing down on us. Clara climbed through the window first, and as I followed, I felt a sudden sharp tug on my backpack. I turned, expecting it to be caught on something, but there was nothing there. I scrambled through the window, heart racing, not daring to look back until we were both outside. We ran to the car in silence, too shaken to speak, and didn't breathe easy until we'd driven far from that cursed place. Back at home, I developed the photos, and everything looked normal, except for one shot. In the image of the main ward, where the empty beds lined the walls, there was a figure standing near the far end of the room. A pale, shadowy form with hollow eyes, staring straight at the camera. I showed the photo to Clara, and she went white as a sheet. We never spoke about the asylum again, and I've never been back. But sometimes, late at night, I can still feel those hollow eyes watching me, as if whatever I saw that day never really left. I wasn't sure if I should share this. Even now, every time I think about that weekend, a chill settles over me. But here it is. It started as an escape, a weekend away from the city with my friends, Kevin and Sarah. We were all tired of the city grind and thought a cabin by the lake would be a perfect retreat. Kevin found a cabin online that seemed perfect, right on the water, with a dock and a little rowboat, surrounded by tall pines that swayed softly in the wind. It looked like something out of a cozy postcard, so we booked it for the weekend without a second thought. The drive up took about 3 hours. As we wound through the narrow, tree-lined roads, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the dense forest. By the time we arrived, it was getting dark. The cabin itself was charming, in a rustic sort of way. It had 2 floors, large windows that faced the lake, and a narrow path that led down to a small dock. Inside, the cabin was cozy, if a bit dusty, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and something else I couldn't quite place. There were photos on the walls, old black and white pictures of the lake and people standing on the dock. I noticed one photo in particular, a group of people in old-fashioned clothes standing outside the cabin. They looked happy, but something about their eyes was unsettling. I shook it off, chalking it up to nerves from the long drive. We unloaded our bags, made some dinner, and cracked open a bottle of wine. Outside, the lake was still, reflecting the full moon above like a mirror. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the soft lapping of the water against the dock. The first night was uneventful, though I woke up once or twice to what I thought was the sound of footsteps on the porch. I didn't want to freak myself out, so I told myself it was just an animal, or the creak of the wood. But I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Sarah and I decided to explore the lake while Kevin stayed behind to make breakfast. We took the rowboat out, gliding across the water, enjoying the silence. The mist was low over the lake, giving everything a ghostly feel, and it was hard to see the opposite shore. At one point, I thought I saw a shape in the mist, something dark, standing near the edge of the water. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just the trees swaying in the distance. We stayed out on the lake for about an hour before heading back. When we got to the cabin, Kevin was on the porch, looking pale and tense. He asked us if we'd been on the porch earlier that morning. We hadn't, and we told him so. He looked away, nodding slowly, and said he must have just been seeing things. That day was overcast, with a steady drizzle that made everything feel damp and cold. We spent most of the afternoon inside, playing cards and telling stories. Every now and then, though, we'd hear soft creaks coming from upstairs. We checked several times, but each time the rooms were empty. That night, things took a turn. We were sitting in the living room, the three of us, chatting over mugs of hot cocoa. I noticed the air had gotten colder, like someone had opened a window, but all the windows were shut tight. Sarah wrapped herself in a blanket and shivered. And then we heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from upstairs. We froze. The footsteps paused, then started again, moving across the ceiling. They sounded heavy, like boots dragging across the old wood. Kevin motioned for us to be quiet and stood up, grabbing the flashlight he'd packed. We followed him up the stairs, moving slowly, each creak of the steps echoing around us. We reached the landing and stood in silence, listening. Nothing. Kevin opened the door to the room where we'd heard the sounds, shining the flashlight inside. The room was empty, just as we'd left it. But there was something strange. The window, which had been closed all day, was now slightly open, letting in a cold draft. We closed the window and went back downstairs, trying to laugh it off. But something didn't feel right. That sense of being watched had settled over me, and I could tell the others felt it too. Later that night, as we lay in our beds, I heard it again. The same dragging footsteps, this time coming from right outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, barely breathing. The footsteps paused for a moment, and then I heard a faint whisper, a low, raspy voice that I couldn't make out. It almost sounded like my name, but not quite. I lay there, paralyzed, listening as the footsteps continued down the hall, and then silence. In the morning, none of us mentioned the sounds, but when I saw Kevin's face, pale and drawn, I knew he'd heard it too. He muttered something about getting out of here, and I didn't argue. We quickly packed up, ready to leave. As we were loading the car, I noticed something in the dirt near the porch. Footprints. They were large, the kind that would be left by heavy boots. They led from the side of the cabin up to the porch and then stopped. There were no prints leading away. Just those few heavy steps, as if someone had walked up to the cabin and disappeared. We didn't stick around to investigate. The drive back was silent, all of us lost in our thoughts. We haven't been back since, and every time I think of that cabin, I get the same uneasy feeling, as though something from that place followed us back. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear those same dragging footsteps moving slowly across the floor above me. And I wonder if somehow whatever was out there is still waiting, just a little closer every time I hear it. I grew up in a small, tucked-away village in the English countryside, surrounded by miles of rolling hills, thick woods, and fields that seemed endless. It's the kind of place where the air is fresh, but silence feels heavy, almost pressing down on you. Growing up, I heard countless tales about the land around us, the old forests supposedly haunted by spirits, the fields where strange lights were seen, even the local well that some believed cursed. My family was mostly sensible. but they respected these stories, always urging me to stay away from the woods after dark. One legend in particular stuck with me. It was about a place called Grieve Hollow, a small steep valley hidden deep within the woods, where people were said to disappear without a trace. According to the story, the hollow was once a burial site, centuries old, where villagers would lay to rest those who had died in unnatural ways. People spoke of it with reverence and a bit of fear, warning that anyone who lingered there after sundown would be lured into the earth by the murmurs. As a teenager, I brushed it off, dismissing it as superstitious nonsense. But the story resurfaced in my mind when I returned to the village as an adult, years later, looking to escape the chaos of city life. I rented a small, cozy cottage on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that held echoes of the past: creaking floors, a hearth worn smooth with age, walls lined with old wooden beams. I found peace there, surrounded by fields and woods, as though I'd stepped back into a simpler time. One night, I decided to go for a walk before bed. It was late September, and a chilly fog had settled over the village, blurring the outlines of the trees and casting a milky haze over the path. The only sound was the crunch of gravel underfoot. As I walked, I found myself wandering farther than usual, down an unfamiliar trail that led into the woods. There was a strange draw to it, an almost magnetic feeling that urged me forward, even as my instincts whispered that I should turn back. After about half an hour, I noticed the air around me was different. Heavy, almost thick, and there was a scent, a faint, earthy smell like damp leaves and something metallic. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized where I was: Grieve Hollow. I could barely see the path in the dim light, but I was sure of it. The trees here were older, their twisted branches weaving a canopy above that seemed to block out the sky entirely. An uneasy silence hung in the air, broken only by a faint rustling sound. It was almost like whispering. As I stood there, something else caught my attention. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet. It was softer, like standing on freshly tilled soil. I knelt down, running my fingers through it, feeling the loose, damp earth that almost seemed to pulse under my hand, as though it were breathing. I don't know how long I stayed there, transfixed, but I felt something, a pull, or maybe a presence urging me to listen closer. I leaned down, closing my eyes, and that's when I heard it clearly. A low, murmuring voice, almost like a chant, coming from somewhere deep below. My heart pounded as I scrambled back to my feet, trying to shake off the feeling. But the murmurs continued, faint but insistent, weaving through the silence. Every rational thought told me to turn and run, yet some strange part of me wanted to stay, to listen. As I stood there, caught between reason and an inexplicable urge to stay, the voice seemed to take shape in my mind, growing louder and more defined. I thought I heard my name whispered on the breeze. "Just tired," I muttered, trying to brush it off as exhaustion and nerves. But the air felt thick with something else, a presence that lingered just at the edge of perception. I decided to turn back, forcing myself to focus on each step, telling myself I was imagining things. I barely made it a few paces when I saw her, a figure in the fog, no more than a shadow at first, standing perfectly still just a few yards away. She was draped in what looked like an old-fashioned flowing dress, the kind you'd see in those faded photographs in history books. Her face was pale, almost translucent, framed by long, tangled hair that seemed to blend into the mist. I couldn't move. We stood there staring at each other. She didn't speak, but I could feel her eyes on me as if she were studying me, deciding something. And then she raised her hand, pointing to the ground in front of her. I don't know why I followed her gesture, but I did. Slowly, I knelt down, touching the earth at my feet. There, half buried, was something cold and smooth. Stone. Clearing the dirt away, I realized it was a small headstone, worn smooth by time, with no name or date, just a single carved symbol that looked like a spiral. I looked up to ask her about it, but she was gone. The fog had thickened, closing in around me, and the murmurs had returned, louder this time, sounding almost desperate. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and turned to leave the hollow. But the path seemed different now, twisting and unfamiliar. I couldn't tell if I'd gone the right way or if I was deeper into the woods. Panic gripped me as I tried to retrace my steps, but no matter which way I turned, I only seemed to go in circles. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found the edge of the woods, stumbling back into the open air of the village. I didn't look back, forcing myself to keep my gaze forward as I hurried home. But even as I crossed the threshold of my cottage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night I barely slept, haunted by the image of that woman and the murmurings that still echoed in my mind. In the morning, I went to the local library to see if I could find any record of Grieve Hollow, or any clues about what I had seen. Most of the old folklore books contained only brief mentions of the place, warning against venturing too far into the hollow after dark. But then, I found a single passage in an old journal from a former villager, dated over 100 years ago. The entry spoke of the same woman, a spirit who was said to guard the hollow, her task to keep the restless souls at bay. The journal claimed that anyone who disturbed the ground there would be marked, drawn back to the hollow until they joined the voices in the earth. My blood ran cold. I thought of the spiral-marked stone, the way the ground had felt like it was breathing beneath my hands, and the voice that had whispered my name. I left the library with a strange sense of resignation. Somehow I knew I would be back in Grieve Hollow, whether I wanted to or not. Every night since then, as I lay in bed, I hear the faint murmuring from somewhere deep in the distance, calling me back. And the worst part? Every night it grows louder. I've been a paramedic for nearly a decade, working in a small town that most people would consider quiet. Sure, we have our share of accidents, the occasional overdose, and once in a while, a heart attack. But in my line of work, we see things that stay with you for reasons beyond blood and broken bones. There are moments when we find ourselves in places that don't feel right. This story takes place on a crisp autumn evening. My partner Mike and I had just started our shift, and things were surprisingly slow. The radio crackled to life around 11 p.m., calling us to an isolated farmhouse on the edge of town. The call was vague, something about a fall and difficulty breathing. We thought it might be an elderly person who'd taken a tumble. These farmhouses around here are old, creaky, and far from town, so it wasn't uncommon for calls like these to be delayed in getting to us. We set off, and as we drove through winding tree-lined roads, the fog thickened. It was so dense that it seemed to swallow our headlights, casting everything in an eerie, silvery glow. Mike glanced over at me, giving a little shrug as if to say, "Just another night." But there was something off. I could feel it in the air, a heaviness that settled in my chest. We arrived at the farmhouse, which was shrouded in shadows and eerily quiet. The place looked like it had been plucked out of a time long gone. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dark except for a faint glow from one room on the second floor. An unsettling thought crossed my mind. I didn't see any movement inside, just that one light. Mike knocked on the door and we waited. No answer. We knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I was starting to think this was some kind of prank, maybe kids messing around. But then, just as Mike was about to knock one more time, the door creaked open on its own. We exchanged a look, one of those, "Did that just happen?" moments. But then he shrugged and stepped inside, so I followed. The interior was just as run down as the outside, with furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved in years. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the dim light as we moved our flashlights around. The place was quiet. Too quiet. There wasn't even the hum of an old fridge, or the ticking of a clock. Just silence. "Hello, emergency services," Mike called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. That's when we heard it. A faint, raspy breathing coming from upstairs. It was so quiet that I almost thought I'd imagined it, but Mike heard it too. Without a word, we made our way up the creaky staircase, each step sounding louder than it should, as if the house itself was listening. The breathing grew louder as we reached the landing, guiding us down a narrow hallway. The only light was coming from a room at the end, casting a sickly yellow glow that made the shadows dance along the walls. We moved slowly, the wooden floor groaning beneath our feet, until we reached the door. Inside, we found an old woman lying on the bed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. She didn't react to us at all, even when we tried to talk to her. It was like she was in a trance. I leaned down to check her vitals, and that's when I noticed her hands. They were ice cold, even though the room was warm. Her skin was paper thin, with deep blue veins running underneath, and her fingers were curled as if she'd been clutching something tight. I reached for her wrist to check her pulse, and that's when her eyes shifted toward me. Just her eyes. Her head didn't move, but her gaze locked onto mine, and there was something in it. Something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't fear exactly, more like desperation. "Please," she whispered, so faintly that I barely heard it. "He won't let me go." I exchanged a glance with Mike, who looked as unsettled as I felt. "Who won't let you go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes drifted to the corner of the room, and her breathing became more erratic, like she was trying to get away from something. I turned my flashlight to the corner, but there was nothing there, just shadows. But the air, it felt different, heavier, colder. Mike, clearly on edge, suggested we get her on a stretcher and out of there. As we moved her, I noticed the strange marks on her wrists, like she'd been tied down at some point. They were faint, barely visible, but they made me uneasy. We managed to get her downstairs, and as we were loading her into the ambulance, I heard the front door creak open again. I glanced back at the house, expecting to see someone watching us from a window, but the house was as dark and still as before. Just that strange silence. The ride back to the hospital was tense. The woman remained quiet, her eyes staring straight ahead, as if she was watching something we couldn't see. Every so often, she would mumble under her breath, saying things like, "He's coming," or "It's almost time." I tried to ask her who he was, but she would just shake her head, a terrified look in her eyes. When we finally reached the hospital, the nurses took her in, and we filled out our report. Mike and I sat in the break room afterward, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. We both felt it, that sense of having walked too close to something we couldn't understand. A few days later, I went back to check on the woman. I wanted to know if she'd recovered, maybe find some answers. But when I asked the nurse on duty, she just gave me a confused look. "She was never brought in," she said, flipping through her records. "There's no one by that description admitted here on that night." I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd been there. I'd seen her. Mike and I had both loaded her into the ambulance. There was no way we'd imagined it. I called Mike, hoping he'd remember something I'd missed. But when I asked him about it, his response made my blood run cold. "Look, I remember the call," he said, his voice sounding far away. "But I don't remember actually bringing anyone back. I thought maybe I dreamed it or something." To this day, I still can't explain what happened. The farmhouse, the woman. It was all too real to have been a dream. I've looked into the records, asked around, but there's no trace of her or that call. The farmhouse is still there, empty and abandoned. I drive by it sometimes, and every time I do, I get that same heavy feeling, like the air is thicker there. And every so often, late at night when it's quiet, I think I hear a faint, raspy breathing in the back of the ambulance. But when I turn around, there's nothing there. Just shadows and silence. First time it happened, I thought it was a nightmare. I was staying in a small, cozy cabin just outside a quiet town, one of those places that barely had cell service and was only a few miles from endless, dense woods. It was late autumn, and the air was cold enough to make you feel like something was watching from the dark. I'd rented the cabin for a week, hoping to escape the city noise and get some writing done. The place was rustic but comfortable, with creaky wooden floors and a fireplace that crackled in the evenings. I'd fallen into a pretty calm routine by the third night. I'd spend the evening by the fire, listening to the faint sounds of the forest just beyond the windows. There was something calming about being so isolated. That third night, though, something strange happened. I remember lying in bed, staring up at the old wooden beams above me, listening to the quiet. The bed was soft, the kind that practically swallowed you whole, and it felt like the darkness in the room was closing in around me. I didn't remember falling asleep, but suddenly, I couldn't move. It was like I was awake, but not quite. I couldn't blink or turn my head, but I could still see, still hear. My body was frozen, locked in place. I tried to tell myself I was dreaming, but then I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the kitchen. At first I thought maybe it was an animal outside, but the footsteps were too solid, too close. They came from the hallway that led to my bedroom. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't even raise my arms to cover my ears or close my eyes. I just lay there, helpless, listening as those slow, dragging steps came closer and closer. I was sure it had to be a dream, but then I felt the mattress sink next to me, as if someone had just sat down. The weight pressed into the mattress, shifting slightly, almost curiously. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't move. I could only lie there, trapped and terrified, staring up at the ceiling. The room was pitch black, but I could feel it. Whatever it was, leaning close. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it, hovering just inches from my face. Then in the silence, I heard something. A whisper. Soft, like a breath brushing against my ear. "Are you awake?" My stomach twisted in fear, but I couldn't respond. The voice was low, chilling, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. I wanted to shut my eyes, but even that was impossible. All I could do was stare into the darkness, waiting, hoping it would end. After what felt like hours, the pressure on the mattress lifted. I heard the footsteps retreat, moving slowly back toward the hallway, and finally fading away. The room was still, and eventually, I could move again. I sat up, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. I could hardly believe what had just happened. I kept telling myself it was sleep paralysis, that it was common, that it wasn't real. I convinced myself to stay. It was just a dream, I thought, a one-time thing. But then, 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, it was worse. I remember lying there, unable to move. But this time, I felt a hand press down on my chest. It wasn't gentle. It was heavy, cold, pinning me down. And then I heard that same voice, closer than before, whispering right next to my ear. "Do you remember me?" My heart was racing and I tried to scream, but again, no sound would come out. The hand on my chest tightened as if daring me to try to fight back. I felt the breath on my neck, warm and unsettlingly real. I lay there, paralyzed, trapped with this thing that seemed to know me, to know my fear. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its eyes on me, studying me. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. The weight lifted, and I was alone again, shaking. The next morning, I was desperate for answers. I went into town and asked the owner of the small cafe if she knew anything about the cabin's history, carefully avoiding any mention of my experiences. She gave me a strange look, but eventually she told me about a man who had lived there years ago. He was a recluse, an old writer who'd become paranoid in his later years, claiming he was haunted by a dark figure. People said he went mad in that cabin, believing he was being watched every night. I felt a chill run down my spine. It had to be a coincidence, right? Just a local legend. But that night, the fear returned with a vengeance. I lay in bed, my heart pounding as I stared at the ceiling, afraid to close my eyes. And then it happened again. The familiar feeling of paralysis washed over me, and I could feel the presence in the room before I even heard the footsteps. This time, they didn't come slowly. They sounded hurried, as if someone was desperate to reach me. And then I felt the hand again, pressing down on my chest, heavier than before. The voice came, but this time it sounded angrier, almost desperate. "Why did you come back?" it whispered. I couldn't respond, couldn't move. I was trapped listening to this phantom voice. And then I felt fingers touch my face, tracing the line of my jaw, as if memorizing my features. My whole body was screaming to wake up, to break free from whatever this nightmare was. But I was powerless. The voice grew quieter, but it was still there, a presence in the dark. "You're mine now," it whispered. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. I sat up, gasping for breath, and immediately ran for the door. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I left the cabin that very moment, not even bothering to pack my things. I just needed to get away from that place. Later, I found out that the writer who'd lived there years ago had died in that very bedroom. No one knew exactly how, but locals said he'd been found lying in bed, eyes wide open, as if he'd seen something horrible. Even now, I wonder if he'd felt the same thing I did. That heavy hand pressing down. That voice in the dark. And every once in a while, as I'm drifting off to sleep, I swear I hear it again. A faint whisper, asking if I remember. I never considered myself a superstitious person, but I suppose we all reach a point where things defy logic, and we're left grasping at straws, trying to make sense of the impossible. I live in a quiet, unassuming town, nestled somewhere between sprawling farmland and dense woodlands. Life here is peaceful and predictable, or at least it was, until last winter. It was early February, the kind of bone-chilling night where even the stars seemed to shiver. I'd been driving home late after visiting my parents, who lived a couple of towns over. The road home was a long, winding stretch that cut through the woods, with hardly a street lamp or house to be seen. Normally, I found the drive peaceful, almost meditative. But that night there was an eerie stillness that made my skin prickle, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The first strange thing I noticed was the figure on the side of the road. It was barely visible in my headlights, a shadow against the blackness, just standing there, not moving. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was dressed in a long black coat that billowed slightly in the wind, his face obscured by a hood. I slowed down instinctively, a chill creeping up my spine, but he didn't turn or wave or do anything to acknowledge my car. Just stood there, watching the road. I drove on, feeling uneasy but trying to shake it off. After all, people do strange things, and maybe he was just lost or waiting for someone to pick him up. Still, there was something about him, about the stillness, the way he seemed so out of place in the dead of night, that left me with a lingering sense of dread. As I continued down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that dark figure standing in the road behind me, closer than before. But each time the road was empty, swallowed up by the night. I told myself I was just being paranoid, letting my imagination get the best of me. That's when I saw him again. This time he was standing a little farther up the road, right on the edge of the forest. I felt a jolt of fear. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me without a car, and I hadn't seen any turnoffs or side roads. My foot eased off the gas as I passed him, my heart pounding. He didn't move, didn't even glance at my car, just stood there, cloaked in shadows, facing the road like he was waiting. I wanted to believe it was some sort of trick of the light, or maybe even two different people, though I knew deep down that wasn't true. He was the same, right down to the way his coat flared out in the breeze. I kept driving, faster this time, trying to put as much distance between me and him as possible. I even turned on the radio to drown out the creeping sense of dread, but the static was worse than the silence. Then, about 5 minutes later, I saw him again. He was closer this time, standing on the edge of the road like he was waiting for me. My blood ran cold as I gripped the steering wheel, refusing to look directly at him. It felt as though his presence was pressing down on me, making the air thick and heavy. I could feel my hands starting to shake, my mind racing. I couldn't explain it, but I just knew, that something wasn't right. I finally reached the small bridge that marked the outskirts of town, a feeling of relief washing over me as I crossed it. Once I was back under the glow of the streetlights, I dared a glance in the rearview mirror. The road was empty. No dark figure, no ominous shadow. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I'd probably just imagined it, that maybe fatigue and the late hour were playing tricks on me. But that night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing on the side of the road, waiting, watching, and even though I was in my own bed with the familiar sounds of the house around me, I felt that same pressing weight, as if he were somehow still there. The next morning I went about my routine, trying to brush off the experience as nothing more than a bad case of nerves. But the feeling of unease lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake. That evening, as I was closing up the small bookstore where I worked, I mentioned it to my friend Lucy. She laughed at first, but then her face grew serious. "You know," she said quietly, glancing around as if someone might overhear us. "There's an old story around here. My grandma used to tell it to me when I was little. People around town say there's a presence that appears to those who are close to death." I scoffed, but there was a sinking feeling in my stomach. "You mean like a grim reaper?" "Sort of," she replied, shrugging. "Not death itself, but more like a warning. People who see him are said to have close calls soon after. Accidents, illness, that sort of thing. But if you're careful, if you heed the warning, you might be able to avoid it." I laughed it off, though the unease stayed with me. I told myself it was just a creepy story meant to scare kids. But over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left the house or looked out the window at night, I half expected to see that figure standing there, waiting. A week later, it happened. I was driving home again, late as usual, and the roads were slick with an unexpected snowfall. I was approaching a bend in the road when my headlights flickered, plunging me into darkness for a split second. My heart skipped a beat, and when the lights came back on, I saw him. Standing in the middle of the road, closer than ever, his face still obscured by that hood. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding and swerving wildly on the icy road. I tried to correct it, but the wheels caught, and I felt the car spinning out of control, sliding dangerously close to the edge of the embankment. Everything seemed to slow down, my heart thundering in my chest as I braced for impact. Then suddenly the car stopped. I sat there gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked up, half expecting to see him standing there in front of my car, waiting. But the road was empty. I was alone, my car teetering precariously close to the edge, but safe. I don't know how long I sat there trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I managed to steady my breathing and pull myself together enough to drive home. But as I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, I thought I saw a shadow moving along the edge of the trees, watching me. I never saw him again after that. But sometimes, on those late nights when I'm driving home alone, I still feel his presence. That heavy, pressing weight that reminds me of how close I came to something I can't explain, something that defies logic. I haven't told many people about it. Most would just say it was a hallucination or an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. Some say he's an omen, a harbinger of death. Others say he's there to offer a warning, a second chance. All I know is that since that night I've driven more cautiously. I've avoided taking risks, and I've learned to listen to that gut feeling, the one that tells me when danger is near. If you're ever driving down a lonely road and see a figure watching you from the shadows, heed the warning. It might just save your life. I'll start by saying that I'm not easily spooked. Years of being a paranormal investigator have taught me that most hauntings can be explained by faulty wiring or creaky floorboards. But this experience, well, it was different. It all began last year when I was asked to document the story of an old Victorian house in a quiet New England town. The house sat on the edge of Maplewood, a town of maybe 1,200 people. Most of the homes in Maplewood were close together, clustered around the main street with its small diner, general store, and post office. But this house stood apart, literally and figuratively, on the outskirts of town, a bit like a dark secret no one wanted to acknowledge. Locals called it the Harrington House, and it had been abandoned for nearly 80 years. Stories about it were common among the townsfolk. Some claimed it was haunted by the spirits of the original owners, while others believed something darker lurked within. Over the years, there had been reports of strange lights in the windows at night, odd noises, and a shadowy figure seen pacing on the top floor. Rumor had it that anyone who dared spend the night in Harrington House left in the dead of night, shaken and silent. My task was to investigate the history and see if I could debunk the legends. The house had last belonged to a family named Harrington, who vanished without a trace in 1935. The family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Harrington and their young daughter Lillian. The records were murky, but the story went that they simply disappeared one cold November night, leaving behind a table set for dinner and no signs of a struggle. As I pulled up to the house, I felt a strange chill, despite the sun hanging low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow on the surrounding fields. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time. Weeds grew up through the cracked path leading to the porch, and the once white siding was now faded to a dull gray. The windows were all intact, but layered with so much dust, they seemed almost opaque. Inside, the air was thick, carrying an unmistakable musty smell of decay and age. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped inside, feeling as though each sound echoed far beyond the room itself. The silence was nearly deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle from a mouse in the walls, or a soft breeze pressing against the old wooden panels. I found myself whispering, even though there was no one around to hear me. I started by looking through the first-floor rooms, careful not to disturb too much. The furniture was sparse. Only a few pieces remained. A dusty armchair in the corner, a toppled-over table in the dining room, and a grand piano surprisingly well-preserved in the parlor. In the dining room, the table was still set. Plates and glasses, long covered in dust and cobwebs, stood as if frozen in time. It was unsettling, but I reminded myself it was all just a strange scene left behind. Perhaps someone had placed it there for effect. I took out my notebook, jotting down these details. Then, just as I was noting the specifics, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere above me. It sounded almost like footsteps moving slowly and methodically. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It started at one end of the floor above and continued across, as though someone were pacing back and forth. I rationalized it as the wind rattling a shutter, or maybe a tree branch brushing against the house, but the tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt too intentional, almost like someone was listening back. Deciding to press on, I climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, and each step groaned under my weight. At the top, there was a long hallway with 4 doors, 3 closed and 1 slightly ajar at the end. The air felt colder up here, and there was a faint smell I couldn't quite place, like something sweet but rotten, clinging to the walls. I moved down the hallway, passing the first door and cautiously opening it. Inside, I found what looked like an old nursery. A small antique crib sat against the wall, covered in a thin layer of dust. Faded floral wallpaper adorned the walls, and a few scattered toys lay abandoned on the floor. I felt an odd pull, an almost overwhelming sense of sadness. The room felt frozen, as though someone had left in a hurry and never returned. Just as I was about to turn and leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the crib. A small, stuffed rabbit, missing an eye and patched in places with clumsy stitches. I reached out to touch it, feeling the coarse fabric, and suddenly, an image flashed through my mind. A young girl laughing as she clutched the toy close to her chest. The vision was so vivid that it startled me. Shaking it off, I stepped back into the hallway. As I moved to the next door, I heard a voice, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakably close. It sounded like a child's voice, murmuring softly, though I couldn't make out the words. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. I moved toward the door at the end of the hall, the one slightly ajar, feeling a strange compulsion to open it fully. Inside, the room was dark, with heavy curtains drawn tight across the windows. I flicked on my flashlight and scanned the space. There was little in the room, save for a tall, antique wardrobe pushed against the far wall. Something about it drew me in, the way it loomed, casting an elongated shadow across the floor. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. When I finally opened it, I found only empty hangers swinging gently, as though disturbed by a recent movement. But just as I turned to leave, I felt it. A cold, almost skeletal hand on my shoulder. It was faint, just a brush, but I felt it clearly enough to make my skin prickle. I whipped around, but the room was empty. I could feel my heartbeat drumming in my ears, but I reminded myself that I was alone. I had to be. At that moment, a sound echoed from downstairs, a long, slow creak. The front door, which I had locked behind me, had somehow opened. The silence that followed was heavy, almost as if it were waiting. Without thinking, I took a step back right into the doorway of the nursery when I heard it again. That faint whisper, this time unmistakable. Lillian. The name sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know who or what was calling it, but I knew I couldn't stay to find out. With a final glance back at the hallway, I turned and hurried down the stairs. As I reached the front door, I looked back one last time, and there, at the top of the stairs, I saw it. A small figure standing in the shadows, just barely visible in the dim light. I left the house as fast as I could, my heart pounding as I fumbled with my keys and sped away down the deserted road. I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching me, following me even as I drove away. Later, when I reviewed my recordings, I noticed something I hadn't heard in real time. Right after I'd opened the wardrobe, there was a faint voice, barely a whisper, saying, "Stay with us." I didn't go back to the Harrington house. Whatever was there, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in that house, in the stillness of that empty nursery, Lillian is waiting for someone who never returned. And the house itself, it's still there, just waiting for the next curious soul to step inside. I've always been someone who loves the outdoors. Growing up in a small town, nestled near a vast stretch of forest, the woods were my second home. My friends and I spent countless summers hiking, camping, and exploring every nook and cranny we could find. Even as an adult, there's nothing I find more relaxing than getting away from the noise of daily life and going out into nature. But there's one trip I took not long ago that changed everything I thought I knew about those familiar woods. It was late September, just as the first chill of autumn began to settle in. I had a few days off work and decided to take a solo trip up to an old cabin my family had owned for years, right on the edge of the forest. The cabin was small and simple, with creaky wooden floors and old-fashioned furniture that looked as if it had been untouched for decades. There was no cell service out there, no Wi-Fi, just complete isolation, which was exactly what I wanted. I arrived just before dusk. The air was crisp and the trees had begun to turn, painting the forest in shades of red and gold. There's something about the quiet that settles over the woods in the fall. It's almost like nature is holding its breath, waiting for something. I unloaded my things, set up my sleeping bag, and lit the old kerosene lamp we kept in the cabin. After making a quick dinner, I settled into the worn armchair by the window, watching as the last light faded from the sky. It was peaceful at first, but then, as the darkness took over, that peace began to shift, almost imperceptibly. The silence grew heavier, pressing in from all sides. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, it had been a while since I'd been alone out here. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it. A faint sound coming from the woods outside. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as I strained to listen, it became clear that it wasn't random. It was a rhythm, a soft, repetitive tapping, like someone was knocking on a tree far off in the distance. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal or maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind. But even as I tried to sleep, that sound stuck with me, weaving its way into my dreams, always just on the edge of hearing. The next morning I went for a hike to shake off the strange feeling. The sun was bright, and everything looked normal. Birds were chirping, squirrels darted through the leaves, and the forest felt alive again. I hiked for a few miles, following a trail I knew well, but as I reached the edge of a clearing, something caught my eye. There, in the middle of the path, was a small pile of rocks, 5 or 6 of them, stacked carefully on top of each other. It struck me as odd, but I figured it was just something left by another hiker. People do that sometimes, right? They build little rock towers as markers or just for fun. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to the knocking sounds I'd heard the night before. I kept walking, but every now and then, I'd come across another stack of rocks, each identical to the first. By the time I found the 4th one, I started to feel uneasy. I knew this trail well, and I'd never seen anything like it before. And the way the rocks were placed, it felt deliberate, as if someone was leading me somewhere. I decided to turn back, picking up my pace as the sky began to cloud over. I don't know what it was, maybe just my own paranoia, but I could have sworn I felt someone watching me from the trees. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there, just shadows shifting in the breeze. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was nearly dark. I locked the door and tried to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd let a few strange sounds and some rocks get under my skin. But that night, the knocking started again. Only this time it was closer. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. It seemed to echo through the darkness, filling the cabin with a slow, deliberate rhythm. My pulse quickened, but I stayed still, telling myself it was just an animal outside. But then something even stranger happened. I heard a voice, low and almost familiar. "Come out," it whispered. It was so faint that I thought I must have imagined it. I stayed where I was, holding my breath, straining to hear. But after a few moments, the voice was gone, and the knocking stopped. The rest of the night was silent. I didn't sleep much, just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was a dream, some half-awake nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But when I stepped outside, there, right in front of the cabin door, was another stack of rocks. This one was different, though, topped with a single black feather. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at it for what felt like forever. I had no idea who could have put it there. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and as far as I knew, no one else was out here. I thought about the voice I'd heard, telling me to come out, and a chill ran down my spine. I spent the rest of the day close to the cabin, not daring to stray too far. I didn't hear any more strange sounds, and by the time evening rolled around, I was beginning to think I'd just let my imagination run away with me. Then, just after sundown, I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the fading light, was a figure, tall, thin, and shrouded in shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel it watching me, standing completely still. For a moment I was frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe just a branch or a shadow. But then it moved. It didn't come closer, just swayed slightly, as if it were waiting, watching to see what I would do. And then, slowly, it raised one hand and tapped on a nearby tree. 3 times, just like before. The sound echoed through the silent woods, and I could feel it vibrating through my bones. I backed into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it, heart racing. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat in the armchair, clutching the kerosene lamp and waiting for the dawn. When the first light crept over the trees, I packed my things and left, leaving the cabin behind without a second glance. To this day, I have no idea what I saw, or if any of it was even real. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe there was something out there, something waiting in those woods. But whatever it was, I haven't been back to that cabin since. And every time I walk past the edge of the forest, I feel it watching, just out of sight, waiting for me to step back into the trees.